Okay, official.
It's official.
All right. Well, hi everyone. Welcome to the TMU portion of the BrainHack School 2025. So before I tell you a bit about TMU and myself and my lab, we'll do a land acknowledgement. So Toronto occupies a place that has been home to Indigenous people for over 15,000 years. The Huron-Wendat, Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wapum Treaty between Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share and protect this land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples and settlers from all over the globe have been welcomed into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Okay. I'm sharing my notes. Oh, that's interesting. I don't actually have any notes. I think. Got it. Let me see if I can fix that. How about now? Still? Huh. I just share normally. Let's see.
Yeah.
Did that work? No, that's weird. Okay.
I've got the guest Wi-Fi.
Oh,
Yeah.
perfect.
All right. I don't think there's anywhere to write it down.
No, I can just take it down here. Wow, this, should I pause the recording? Or no, well, this is just gonna be recorded. Okay. The Wi-Fi.
Can you go too soon? Sorry.
Yes.
I don't want to. Yeah, I just share here.
Sure.
And then yeah, choose that one. And that should be fixing it.
Any luck, Richie? Okay, great. Perfect. Okay, I'll give you the Wi-Fi is.
Yeah, so I'll shout it out too. So if everybody go to your Wi-Fi network, select TMU, and then in the username you want to put guest.wi-fi. And then for the password, it's going to be capital M like Michael. Then the open round brackets. So on a laptop that should be shift 9. Then lowercase b 5 3. Then the little accent sign, so that should be shift 6, so it's these ones. Uppercase U like umbrella, and then lowercase s. All right, did that work for everyone? Did that not work for anybody? All right, I'm gonna guess we're all good
Thank
there.
you so much.
And I'm just gonna check
Yeah.
it. Okay, amazing.
Perfect. Thank you so much for getting it.
Anything else?
I think we're good. Yeah, thank you.
If you need anything,
Okay.
just shoot me an email.
Okay, amazing. Thanks. Oh, so everyone has the Wi-Fi. Sounds good. Okay, excellent. Okay, I think we're officially set up. TMU actually technically starts on the 10, so we're only 5 minutes behind. So, okay, so yeah, again, welcome to TMU. I'll start by telling you a little bit about myself and then about TMU and then a little bit about a study that I did recently that part of it was done at one of the BrainHack sessions that I attended a few years back now. So a question that I'm really interested in is how does the developing mind support complex learning? I joined the numerical cognition lab as a volunteer when I was in the 3rd year of my undergrad. That's me around that time. I stayed on to do an honors thesis in that lab for my 4th year. And for that honors thesis, what I did, it was an intervention where basically we gave kids an iPad intervention every day and we helped them learn numbers and help them learn math. And so basically, I went in at 8:30 every morning, hung out with those kids, and watched them go from not knowing what a number was to learning how to count, learning that numbers have orders, and for some of them doing basic arithmetic. So I became really interested in how people go from basically knowing nothing about a concept to having a full understanding of this abstract ability to understand what a number is, and then ultimately using that knowledge to do something really complicated like math, like working with numbers, everything you're going to be doing here in this course. So I chose to keep working on math primarily because it is a complex skill with a really simple foundation. And I thought that was really exciting. Um, it's a culturally recent invention, so it's something that our brains didn't evolve to do, but it's rooted in these evolutionarily ancient systems. And I think that that makes math as a model for learning a really fascinating system to study. Practically, it's also really interesting because students are not doing well. Last year, half of grade 6 students failed to meet provincial standards. So from both a theoretical and a practical perspective, I think it's really exciting to be studying, how kids learn math, why some kids struggle. So I stayed on in the numerical cognition lab for my master's and my PhD, studying those questions at Western at the Brain and Mind Institute. And then I was trying to figure out what to do after, and I ended up doing a postdoc at the Rotman Research Institute with Brian Levine, studying a little bit more about memory and that sort of stuff. I was a postdoc with your TA Ryan. We shared an office very briefly, and yeah, and then a couple of years ago now, so July 2023, I became a new professor here at Toronto Metropolitan University and launched the Neuroimaging Development and Educational Attainment Lab. We call it the NeuroIdea Lab for short. There's a number of NeuroIdea Lab members in the room, so nice to see some friendly faces. Yeah, and so here I am at TMU, and I'm happy to welcome you to the school. So I'll tell you a little bit about TMU as a university. So we've been granting degrees only since 1971. So TMU has quite an interesting history compared to other schools like U of T. It was built on the grounds of what they called the Normal School, which was TMU's first teachers college, and then it became the Institute for Technology, so a polytechnic institute, before it officially gained university status in 1993 and became ranked by Forbes. So it was again in 1993 that it became a university. As you can see out the window, we are located like truly in the heart of Toronto. We actually have classrooms that are in the Cineplex movie theater. So we rent space because space is an issue because it's a new school and this like interesting place. So I actually went and saw the Marvel movie in a classroom that I taught in the evening, which was kind of exciting. And then the next week I was like, I'm so sorry, this class is probably not as exciting as the Marvel movie, but we've been rated as the #1 employer in Canada for diversity by Forbes. And yeah, it's a nice place. I'll tell you a little bit about this room that we're in. So this is called the Atrium on Bay. So again, I mentioned that TMU has to often rent space. Like U of T is a much older institution. It owns a lot of buildings on the slightly west end of the core, whereas TMU, we do a lot of renting. So this is one of those spaces. It's this new shared space between the Department of Psychology and the Faculty of Science. So you might see people around here doing kind of other stuff. Yeah, and psychology has basically half of this floor. But what's kind of interesting about it is when you're on the elevator, there's like every floor has people doing all kinds of different things, and we're sort of a university in an office building in this space specifically. So the Department of Psychology, there's a bunch of different areas in our department. I'm part of a couple. I'm part of developmental, but also the applied cognitive neuroscience area, so ACN. ACN is a really unique area for an institution. It blends rigor and advanced methodologies of cognitive neuroscience with more of an emphasis on social relevance. So a lot of our researchers will use their neuroscience work in more like applied settings. So for example, we have someone who looks at brain recording when people are singing as part of a choir. That's Frank Russo, and trying to understand how that might help with issues with aphasia and loneliness and that sort of thing. So it's a little bit more applied than other neuroscience departments that I've been a part of. We have 15 active labs that span all kinds of different areas, from auditory cognition, attention, memory, emotion, decision-making, development, which is our lab, and cognitive aging. And there's a whole bunch of research methods that are used within the department. So behavioral methods and eye tracking, computational modeling, EEG, neuroendocrinology. So we have a large stress lab where people collect like cortisol data, genetic data, that sort of stuff. There's brain stimulation, so TNRS and TDCS, functional neuroimaging with fMRI and FNIRS. We don't have an fMRI scanner, although we're trying to get one, but most people will scan at different hospitals. So like our lab would scan at Baycrest. A lot of people scan at UHN. Then beyond psychology, there's also a lot of exciting neuroimaging work going on at TMU. So for example, in the electrical, computer, and biomedical engineering department, there's a professor named April Kademi who developed machine learning tools to automatically analyze MRI brain images and detect structures in the brain. And this has resulted in a tool, a patented tool that can help transform how clinicians diagnose dementia and vascular disease, which she's hoping will lead to earlier detection and improve patient outcomes. So that's something that I think is really exciting going on outside the psychology department. So what about my lab? So again, I recently launched the Neuroimaging Development and Educational Attainment Lab. And our main focus in my lab is the development of the mathematical mind. So again, we use a lifespan approach. So looking at really little kids who are in the process of understanding that like this means 3, all the way through to like mathematicians and experts in science, technology, engineering, and math. We study core competencies. So basic numerical thinking, what is a number, spatial thinking, and then also memory and imagery. But then, people are not just mini computers, right? We have thoughts, we have feelings, we grow up in cultures. So we also look at socio-emotional factors. So things like math anxiety, the fear of doing math, differences in sex and gender in relation to feelings about doing math. We use both behavioral and neuroimaging approaches. And then, in the spirit of this TMU department where we do applied cognitive neuroscience, we also look at real world outcomes. So things like academic achievement, how do these early predictors relate to who's going to select and succeed in courses and also occupations in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So before I jump in and tell you just a little bit about one study that I've done that BrainHack helped me to do back when I was, I think, a postdoc, are there any questions about TMU, the school, me, how I got here, where the coffee is? Okay. Okay, so I'll tell you a little bit about this one study. So for this study, I was really interested in understanding who selects and succeeds in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So for a room like this, like how did you end up here, right? There's been a lot of work that's been done on things like family backgrounds, academic achievements, socio-emotional factors like math anxiety, but relatively little had been looked at in relation to cognitive factors. So there'd been a little bit of work on spatial thinking, like this ability to mentally transform something in your mind or navigate through space. But that was kind of it. So I had finished my PhD studying how kids learn math, how kids learn numbers, of course, was at that stage that we so often end up at where you finish one degree and you're like, well, what the heck am I going to do now, right? And I was sitting there and thinking, what am I going to do now? And I met Brian Levine at Baycrest Hospital, and he had this really interesting population of individuals who have severely deficient autobiographical memory and imagery. So they have an inability to vividly remember something from their lives. He called it SDAM, severely deficient autobiographical memory, and it's a sister condition to a condition called aphantasia, which is an inability to visualize anything in the mind's eye. So again, like if you close your eyes and you imagine an apple, for how many of you can you like see it as though you're looking at an apple? It's like perfectly vivid. Okay, how many people is it like sort of a schematic? Like you can kind of see it, but it's not like super clear. And is there anyone who like you can't see anything at all? Like you understand the concept of an apple, but it's like you can't see it visually. Unusual. So often people raise their hand to that question. And those people are thought to have what we call aphantasia, an inability to visualize anything in their mind's eye. And anecdotally, Brian had noticed that many of these individuals were really overrepresented in occupations that required math and computational thinking. So I decided to join his lab and we explored whether essentially that's real. Do people with really poor visual imagery tend to go into occupations in math and STEM? Is there something that like maybe is valuable about that cognitive profile? So that was the question. That's how I ended up spending 4 years at Baycrest. That's how I met Ruchi. So the first problem with this was defining occupations. So when you think of an occupation, it's this really unwieldy information space, right? You might call the same occupation different names, or you might have the same name for different occupations. So this was a bit of a nightmare. So Ruchi and I spent some quality time looking in the Occupation Classification Network, ONET, where we looked at 996 representative occupations. And ONET, it's like this US data set that talks about the skills, abilities, and knowledge required to do those jobs. And so each of these occupations had ratings, and they had 120 ratings of what the skills, the knowledge, etc. were for that occupation. So for example, chemists had really high ratings on chemistry knowledge, right? Like that kind of stuff. And so what we did was we took all of that data and we ran a principal components analysis. So essentially took all the data and found a line, sort of like a regression line, that best explained the variability of all of those numbers. And the first line that came out, if you look along this x-axis, was the degree to which the occupation fell within a STEM discipline. So a high score on that first regression line, that first principal component line, is how STEMmy or how humanities the occupation was. You can see the engineers are all hanging out on the right, social scientists, English professor, that kind of stuff on the left. So then we looked at the second latent variable, the second principal component. So essentially we took all the data and we're like, okay, given that this first line explains all the variability, what is the next line that explains the next most variability in this data? And so that would be the y-axis. And here you can see that we seem to be separating occupations that fall in more health-related disciplines, like doctors, nurses, that sort of stuff, from more computational disciplines. So math, science, computer scientists, that sort of thing. So then we published this paper. All the analyses, the data, the clustering, everything are available through GitHub, an original Shiny app created through Ruchi and Luke in Hervé Abdi's lab as well. And what this meant is that we now have the ability to take any person's occupation, recode it into this ONET space, and get a score for them on how much their job requires STEM and how much it requires math compared to health. Does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions there? Okay. So then what we did was we took Brian Levine's online sample and we recoded those occupations. So basically he had like 30,000 people. We took about 5,000 that fit all our criteria, and we took all their free entry occupations, like, I'm a teacher, I'm a chief engineer, whatever. And we recoded it into this occupation space. Everyone got a score of how STEMmy and how mathy their jobs were. Brian hates when I use the word STEMmy or mathy, but he's not here. And we looked at also their object and spatial imagery, right? So we have scores of like how good their spatial imagery is and how detailed their visual imagery is. So in other words, are they aphantasic? And just to tell you a little bit about those scales, so the spatial items, it's stuff like my images are more like schematic representations than detailed pictures. I can easily imagine and rotate 3D objects in my mind. Whereas the object items, my images are bright and colorful. I have a photographic memory, that kind of stuff. So, and people tend to score high on one or the other of these two questionnaires, but not both. And so what did we find? So just to orient you to these graphs, along the y-axis are people's scores on dimension 2, right? That's the one we're interested in, how much their occupation requires math, how mathy is the occupation. And then on the y-axis is their scores on spatial imagery on the left and visual imagery on the right. So how spatial, how visual are these people? And here's what we find. So first, looking at spatial processing, we see a positive relationship between spatial thinking and having an occupation in math, right? Does this shock anyone? We kind of know this, right? Space relates to math. This was true for both males and females, but especially strong in males. But then was like our new question, right? This is why I went to Baycrest and did this postdoc. What's happening with visual imagery? And we actually did find this negative association for visual imagery, but only in males. In other words, males with really high visual image, or sorry, males with really bad visual imagery ability, so with like aphantasia, for example, seem to be overrepresented in occupations that require math and computational thinking. So I must admit, I saw these data and I was like, there's no way. This is like, a weird thing that happened. So I went back to some of my PhD data to see like, is this true in undergrads with respect to their grades in their math courses? So same question, I just happened to have those same measures. And I had collected their transcripts over the 4 years of their undergrad for these kids based on how many math courses they took and what their grades were. And we found the exact same thing. So in this small sample of like 200 undergrads from Western University, the boys who had really bad visual imagery were taking more math courses and doing better in them. So by this point, I was like, okay, this is kind of convincing. I actually don't have these data here, but I emailed Adam Zeman in Cambridge. I don't know. He's the main aphantasia guy, and he sent us 30,000 people. And again, males with aphantasia were overrepresented in occupations that require math. So we replicated it in three samples. So by this point, we were like, okay, this is pretty convincing. So that's what happened behaviorally. And then Ruchi and I again were hanging out and we're like, we should look at the brain. And so what we did was we went into the NKI data set, so the Rockland data, which you might have heard about earlier in the week, but it's one of these freely available consortium data sets, and it's one of very few that has occupation, so free entry occupation again. So again, we recoded occupations so the data set has like just under 1,000 adults and 200 kids with neuroimaging scans. We pre-processed their data through the Virtual Brain UK Biobank pipeline. And so we ended up with measures of brain connectivity, cognitive scores, and then also academic and occupational attainment. So again, we recoded all of those occupation measures into our space. So again, every single person in this data set now has a score of how much their occupation is in STEM and how much it requires math. And then Ruchi taught me how to examine network segregation. So we basically took our functional connectivity matrix and we parceled it into 7 brain networks. So we had visual, somatomotor, dorsal attention, ventral attention, limbic, frontal parietal, and default. And we got a score, a network segregation score for each of these networks. So in other words, every network has a score. If it's high in network segregation, that means that that network, the regions within it, spend more time talking to each other than they do to regions in other networks, right? In other words, that network is more segregated from the rest of the brain. Are there any questions about what that means? So the calculation is essentially just like more within network connectivity compared to between network connectivity divided by within network connectivity. That's it. So that's the score. And we had a parcellation, we mapped those regions onto the networks and we calculated that score. So the next step is pretty straightforward. We basically now wanted to look and see, do our occupation scores. So in this case, we had 3. We had the complexity of the occupation, how much it fell in STEM, and how much it fell in math, because this was a lower socioeconomic status sample, so we needed the complexity in there too. And then we had our 7 network segregation scores. And what do we find? So again, 7 network segregation scores, 3 occupation dimension scores, same ones as the behavioral data. And this is what we found. Anyone see anything exciting going on? So a few things to point out here. One, the network segregation scores relate to each other. That's good, right? That's like a sanity check. And then the other thing we noted is that there seems to maybe be some relationship going on between the network segregation scores and again, this computational versus health, this math occupational score at the bottom here. So we ran a partial least squares regression, which I believe you're going to be learning about soon from Ruchi. And essentially what that does is it looks at the degree to which all the network segregation variables relate to all of the occupation variables. And what we found, so then there's one latent variable that explains the relationship between those two sets of variables, network segregation and occupation. And what we found is that there was a strong association between having an occupation in math and segregation of the visual system, the salience ventral attention system, the limbic system, and the control system. And what I thought was really exciting about these findings is that when we split this sample by gender, the visual system relationship was driven entirely by males. So in other words, males with a segregated visual system are overrepresented in occupations that require math, paralleling that behavioral finding that males who report very low visual imagery are overrepresented in math. So I have a lot of thoughts and questions about this, but just for the sake of time, that is all I'm going to present today. I think there's some interesting questions about like why, what is it that having bad imagery might in turn make someone good at that leads them to, selecting and succeeding in math. I think that's a really interesting question. And two is what's going on with these females, right? Are the low imagery females maybe ones who actually would be quite well suited to certain occupations, but maybe aren't because of social barriers? Or is there some sort of biological difference? I think that's a really interesting and exciting question. So that's what I did when I attended BrainHack a couple years ago now. Just to thank some people, I want to thank my postdoc advisor, Brian Levine, all of our collaborators, especially Ruchi, all the research assistants who were involved in this work, who helped code the occupations and other stuff, the participants who participated in the study, and then my two institutions where the study was done, all the funding sources that supported this work. And also, I really want to thank you all for your interest and your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions if you have them. Or thoughts. Yeah, that's a great question. So I did not personally get that, but what happened was, so I showed you that article where that woman was like, I don't have a memory. Like, I don't have episodic autobiographical memory. So our postdoc advisor, Brian Levine, like wrote an article. He met her somewhere and he wrote this article being like, isn't this wild? This person doesn't have an episodic autobiographical memory. And he published it in Wire, this magazine. And then he started getting flooded with emails being like, I also don't have an episodic autobiographical memory. I also don't have visual imagery abilities. And he was getting so many that he set up a survey and was like, if you also, relate to this, please fill in our survey and tell us about your memory. And there are now 40,000 responses. And Ryan has cleaned all of those data. And so, so basically I've been working on this in relation to occupation. Ryan's been working with that data set in relation to trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. And so it's crazy because we have these like massive behavioral data sets and people who like continue to want to fill it out. Yeah, so that's how we got that massive sample. We're currently collecting data, or just starting to with Grace, my incoming grad student, on extreme occupations. So trying to get people who are like doing PhDs in physics versus in like humanities to fill in these surveys. I'm not as confident that they're going to be like as excited to do it as the memory people, but fingers crossed we'll get a good sample there too. Yeah, is it still running, the survey? Do you know, are we still collecting data on the Yeah, sure. Ryan probably has the link if anyone's curious or interested to look at it. Yeah, totally. It's a great idea. Also, if anyone's doing a PhD in math, math, physics, engineering maybe, or English or humanities, that we'll have another one too that we'd be really happy to have people fill out, or pilot as well. Yeah, great questions. Anyone else? Any thoughts? Yeah.
In regards to the PCA you did.
Yeah.
So did you have the intention to only pull out two components or?
It's a good question. So I think we hope to find more components, but we also kind of went in like without a real plan, right? Like we didn't totally know what we were going to find. We just pulled that data and kind of plopped it into the PCA and looked to see how many significant variables like explain more than I think like 15% of the variance, something like that. I was personally hoping for something about math because I came from doing 7 years on how kids learn math, and I would have felt a little sad had we not found anything about math. But so the other thing about that, it's a great question. There actually are more dimensions, and it's very flexible, the PCA. So for example, on the Shiny app, you could, like, if you're interested in occupation, you could go online and you could select, like, I want people who have only finished university, or I want people who haven't started university and I want to learn about like those kinds of jobs. And you can extract like different dimensions based on the constraints that you put on it. So for us, for that paper, we were really interested in people who had finished university because we were interested in cognitive jobs. Whereas with the Rockland study, we included everyone, and that's why we had that occupation complexity measure to try and understand like cognitive versus labor style positions. But yeah, so I talk about two dimensions because those are the two that like I'm excited about. There are technically more, and you could go in and ask based on your question. There is one that I think might be about music that we haven't really explored, but like keep looking at. Yeah, so that's another one as well.
Those two dimensions both seem logical to me in some sense. So
Yeah.
But I know putting a label on some of the components can be a little bit difficult. So
Totally.
I didn't know if you had any ideas about what other dimensions could potentially be.
Yeah, so if you like, we also labeled it manually, right? It was totally subjective labeling. It was like me and Ruchi eating candy, looking at these things, being like, looks like STEM to me. So it was subjective, which obviously isn't. We did get ChatGPT to check it at one point, and had a good correlation there. I don't know. But yeah, no, the app is available and you could totally open it and like look at the dimensions, see if you have an idea of like a different labeling system or another dimension that we might have looked at and been like, I don't know. Yeah, great question. Yeah, anything else?
Either maybe from observation in your lab or just opinion as well. How fixed are like spatial thinking and visual imagery, maybe across the lifespan, like
Yeah.
thinking of your undergrad versus then, do those things change?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think people, it's an open question. People don't know a lot about that. I have a collaborator at OISE, Zach Hawes. He has a really nice math lab there as well and does neuroimaging stuff. And he focuses a lot on spatial thinking. He loves spatial thinking. And he has done some interventions where they train kids on spatial thinking in like grade 2, and they do like a whole bunch of like education-based spatial tasks, games, that sort of stuff. And he shows like great improvements in their spatial abilities, which transfer to math. So their math scores go up following this intervention. So there's some pretty good evidence to suggest that spatial thinking is malleable and trainable, certainly at specific developmental windows. I have not seen anything for visual imagery. Have you guys seen any visual imagery training? Yeah, it seems stable across time, but I also don't know of anyone who's tried to train it, right? Like or tried hard to train it. So it could be malleable, but I think the data so far shows that it's stable. I also think it's quite an interesting potential early predictor of which child might go on to struggle with math, right? It's something that's not as influenced by like early socioeconomic status and culture and that sort of stuff compared to like early literacy, early numeracy. And so I think in some ways the stability of it makes it a really interesting variable as like a neuroprognosis, right? Like, does a kid with a really connected visual system, are they likely to go on to struggle with math? Like, that would be a great thing to be able to identify and support them before they fall behind the class. Yeah, great question. Okay. Well, if there isn't anything else, I think I'll definitely stop recording. Stop share.